Right now in your pocket, you are carrying more processing power than the spacecraft that reached Pluto. And yet, right now, 3 billion miles from where you're sitting, we possess something almost nobody talks about. Sharper, closer photographs of a frozen world at the edge of our solar system than we have of parts of our own ocean floor. Sit with that for a second. We know more about a dwarf planet than we know about huge stretches of the planet under our own feet. Here's the strange part. At Pluto, the sun looks about 1,000 times dimmer than it does here. NASA actually built a website for it. Type in your city, and it tells you the exact minute tonight when the light outside your window will match high noon on Pluto. Step outside then, and you're standing in Pluto's daylight. You could recreate the lighting of Pluto in your own backyard tonight, but you could not send anything there. Not a probe, not a camera, not a signal with a return date. One machine has ever stood in that light and looked back at us. And right now, no second one is coming. Almost nobody knows why. So why not just build another one? It's not secrecy, it's not disinterest. The real answer comes down to a specific, engineerable ceiling almost nobody outside mission control ever talks about. A hard physical limit that decides who gets to go back to Pluto and who doesn't. And here's the part that should unsettle you. Right now, in this current budget cycle, the only spacecraft humanity has ever sent to Pluto very nearly got switched off mid-flight. Not decades ago, recently, while it was still out there working. There's also a date, a real one. Any serious return mission needs a specific alignment of the planets to even make the trip possible, and that window is closing before this decade ends. Stay with me, because most of this never makes the headlines. If you want the parts mission control doesn't put in press releases, subscribe before we go further. Before we go further, one promise. Everything you're about to hear comes straight from NASA and JPL records, the National Academy's official planetary Decadal Survey, and published papers from the scientists who actually designed these missions. Every source is linked below in the comment section, so you don't have to take our word for any of it. That's the difference here. We're not chasing panic or exaggeration for clicks. We're bringing you what's real, laid out plainly, so you can verify it yourself. No fake urgency, just the truth, sourced. To understand why NASA won't go back, you have to go back yourself, all the way to January 2006 to Cape Canaveral, where a spacecraft called New Horizons sat waiting on an Atlas V rocket. When it launched, it became the fastest object human hands had ever built, tearing away from Earth at 36,000 miles an hour. Nothing before it had left this planet that fast. Nothing has since. Behind that launch was one man who had spent almost 20 years getting it there. His name was Alan Stern, and by the time New Horizons finally lifted off, he had watched NASA cancel a mission to Pluto again and again, at least 6 times between 1990 and 2005. Too expensive, they said. Too complicated. Not important enough. Stern later described those years simply. It felt like being trapped in a maze, he said, with the exit always just out of reach. And when the mission finally flew, it flew on almost nothing. $650 million sounds like a fortune until you learn it barely covered the spacecraft itself. There was no golden record on board, the way Voyager carried humanity's music and voices into the dark. No plaque, no message for anyone who might find it. New Horizons wasn't built for grandeur. It was built to get there, look fast, and keep moving. A single modest flyby, nothing more was in the budget. But here's the detail that should stop you. In January 2006, when that rocket cleared the tower, Pluto was still the 9th planet. It was still the one you memorized in school, the last stop on every poster of the solar system taped to a classroom wall. And by that same summer, the very same year New Horizons launched, while the spacecraft was still barely past Mars, astronomers voted to strip Pluto of its planetary status altogether. So think about what that spacecraft was actually carrying. Not a message for aliens, something quieter. It was the only thing racing toward a world that had just been told, by the people who study the sky for a living, that it didn't count anymore. New Horizons didn't know that. It kept going anyway. And in a strange way, so did everyone who never stopped believing Pluto deserved better. Here's the assumption most people make. New Horizons crossed 3 billion miles in under 10 years. So surely, a return trip is just a matter of building another one and pointing it in the same direction. That assumption is wrong, and the reason why is the first real twist in this story. New Horizons was built to fly past Pluto, not stop there. Speed was the entire point. The faster it moved, the sooner it arrived. But an orbiter has to do the opposite. It has to shed almost all of that speed once it gets there, slow down enough to fall into orbit and match Pluto's own lazy crawl around the sun. That takes fuel, and fuel takes weight, and weight takes an entirely different kind of mission. The one team that actually sat down and engineered this seriously called their concept Persephone, named fittingly for the queen of the underworld. On paper, it's a $3 billion mission, riding NASA's most powerful rocket, the SLS Block 2, and it wouldn't even attempt a shortcut. It would swing past Jupiter first, using the giant planet's gravity like a slingshot, and then spend 27.5 years quietly cruising the rest of the way to Pluto. Only after nearly 3 decades in transit would it finally begin its actual science, a 3-year orbital campaign, circling the world new horizons only glimpsed in passing. Sit with that math for a second. If a mission like this launched today, the scientists proposing it wouldn't see their own results until they were in their 70s. Some of them wouldn't see it at all. This isn't a project. It's an inheritance, handed from one career to the next. So distance isn't really the obstacle people assume it is, timeline is. But even that isn't the deepest problem. There's something else standing in the way. And it has nothing to do with how far Pluto sits from Earth. It has to do with what happens once you actually get there and the sun all but disappears behind you. That shift from speed to distance reframes how close humanity actually is to going back. It isn't a matter of patience. It's simply a matter of raw physics most of us were never taught. That physics starts with something as simple as light. Out where Pluto orbits, daylight itself all but disappears behind you, and that changes everything about how a spacecraft survives. Out at Pluto, sunlight is roughly 1,000 times weaker than it is here on Earth. Faint enough that the sky stays dark enough to see stars even at high noon. Solar panels, the kind that quietly power satellites circling our planet, are effectively useless out there. There simply isn't enough light left to catch, no matter how wide you spread the panels. So every spacecraft that ventures that deep into the solar system runs on something else entirely. A small block of steadily decaying plutonium, its heat converted directly into electricity. It's called a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, and it is the only thing capable of keeping a spacecraft alive, warm, and transmitting across 3 billion miles of near total darkness for decades at a stretch. Here's the twist. Almost nobody outside planetary science circles ever really hears about. America does not have an unlimited supply of that plutonium. Production stopped for a long stretch of years, then restarted at a slow, careful pace, and today it comes in small, expensive batches that every mission with a serious Kuiper Belt ambition has to line up for. Persephone's instrument list was ambitious enough that it needed more power than a single one of these generators could reliably provide, so its designers had to plan around 2. And missions that require more than one currently struggle to even get selected, not because the science is weak, but because the fuel to run it is one of the scarcest, most tightly rationed resources anywhere in the American space program. Think about that for a moment. The thing standing between us and Pluto isn't distance, isn't rocket power, isn't even money in the usual sense. It's a stockpile of radioactive material smaller than most people imagine, being carefully rationed out, mission by mission, year by year, decade by decade. So the real barrier was never really the 3 billion miles of empty space out there. It's a quiet fuel shortage most people have never heard of, sitting behind nearly every decision NASA makes about anything sent that far from the sun. If that surprised you, stay with us, because it only gets stranger from here. If you grew up believing, deep down, that Pluto was still the 9th planet, drop that word below. We're genuinely curious how many of you are actually still out there. Even if Persephone had somehow solved its power problem, it still needed one more thing. A yes. And that yes doesn't come from a single administrator signing off in an office somewhere. It comes from a vote, a real one, cast every 10 years by hundreds of planetary scientists across the entire country in a process called the Decadal Survey. Whatever mission wins that vote becomes NASA's next flagship, funded and built. Whatever loses simply waits, sometimes for another 10 years, sometimes longer. Most people assumed Pluto, still riding the fame of New Horizons, would win this easily. It didn't. When the results of the 2023 survey finally came in, the scientific community crowned a completely different target as its top new priority. An orbiter to Uranus, a planet most of us haven't thought about since a diagram in a science class decades ago. Mission by mission, the committee judged Uranus the more achievable choice, lower risk, buildable with technology that already exists today, and scientifically overdue in a way the panel found more pressing than a return to Pluto. Persephone wasn't dismissed or waved away. It was taken seriously enough to be fully designed, fully costed, and studied down to its individual instruments by real engineers at real labs across the country. 11 separate instruments, a decades-long flight plan, a full mission architecture, worked out as if it were already approved. But when the final round came, the stage where a short list of finalists gets evaluated for genuine technical and cost risk, Persephone was one of 8 concepts that made it that far and no further. It didn't fail on its merits. It simply lost. To a colder, quieter, more distant planet, almost nobody watching from home expected to beat it. Think about what that means for the people who spent years building that proposal. They didn't fail a test. They won every round of scrutiny they could, right up until the very last one, and then watched a different world get chosen instead. And And that's the detail that stings most, if Pluto has always been the one you rooted for. It isn't that NASA said no, it's that the very people whose job is to weigh one wonder of the solar system against another looked closely at both and chose Uranus instead. Even that isn't quite the end of it, though, because the planet that won still needs its own funding to become something real, and right now, funding is the one thing NASA has the least of. This is the fourth thread, and it's the one closest to right now. In 2025, a proposed federal budget put nearly a quarter of NASA's entire funding on the chopping block, one of the largest single-year cuts the agency had ever faced. Buried inside that plan was something that should stop anyone who watched the 2015 flyby live in real time, refreshing a page for new photos of a world nobody had ever seen up close before. New Horizons itself, the only spacecraft humanity has ever sent to Pluto, was on the list to be shut down. Not hypothetically, not someday, but now. Actually, mid-mission, while it was still out there working, still transmitting data back from deeper in the Kuiper Belt than any human-made object had ever traveled. Jupiter's Juno probe, still returning stunning images after nearly a decade in orbit, sat on that same list, right beside it, 2 working missions marked for the same quiet ending. Congress pushed back, and most of that funding was ultimately restored, largely because scientists, advocacy groups, and ordinary people who cared enough to write letters and make calls refused to let it happen quietly. That pressure worked. But surviving a budget fight isn't the same thing as being strong. NASA's Planetary Science Division is still operating roughly $200 million below what it had just the year before, a gap that doesn't disappear just because the worst-case outcome was avoided. And the Uranus mission that beat Pluto for the top spot in that hard-fought vote has received only about $10 million toward getting started, barely enough to begin the paperwork, let alone design, build, and launch an actual spacecraft capable of surviving a multi-decade journey. So here, finally, is where all 4 of these separate threads come together and meet. A Pluto return isn't waiting behind Uranus in some orderly line, patiently taking its turn. It isn't in the line at all. It lost the distance problem to time itself. It lost the power problem to a plutonium shortage nobody outside a lab ever discusses. It lost the vote to a colder, farther planet. And now it's losing the money to a budget fight that very nearly took down the one working Pluto mission humanity already has in hand. So why does any of this actually matter to you? Because underneath all the budget fights and rocket engineering sits one question that isn't really about Pluto at all. It's about water. Persephone was designed, more than anything else, to answer whether Pluto is hiding a subsurface ocean, a layer of liquid water sealed beneath miles of ice, kept warm not by sunlight, but by heat left over from the world's own violent formation billions of years ago. That may sound like a strange thing for a frozen little world at the very edge of the solar system to be hiding, but it's the exact same question driving missions toward Jupiter's moon, Europa, and Saturn's moon, Enceladus, both of which already show real evidence of vast oceans locked beneath their icy, cracked shells. Wherever there's liquid water, sheltered and stable for long enough, there's a chance, however small, for something resembling life to take hold. That's not science fiction. It's not exaggeration for the sake of a good story. That's the actual reason serious scientists keep quietly returning to these frozen little worlds instead of simply writing them off as dead rocks with nothing left to teach us. Now picture standing there on Pluto's nitrogen ice plains at high noon. The sun overhead is roughly 1,000 times dimmer than the one you know, but it's still bright enough to read by, bright enough to cast a shadow at your feet. Above you, Charon hangs in the sky, appearing about 7 times larger than our own moon looks from Earth, close enough that you could trace its gray, frozen features with your eyes alone. It's dim enough up there to still make out stars in the daytime sky. Cold, quiet, and strangely beautiful, not the lifeless void people imagine when they hear the word Pluto. And maybe that's exactly why so many of you have never let this world go. Not really, not even after all these years. You grew up drawing 9 planets on a poster board taped to a classroom wall, memorizing them in order, chanting some silly sentence to keep the names straight. And then, one summer, without your vote, without anyone asking your opinion at all, Pluto was simply erased from the official list. Some of you decided right then, quietly, that you didn't agree with that decision, and you never really changed your mind. You still don't. And whether or not anyone ever secures the funding to sail a spacecraft back into orbit around that small, defiant, stubborn little world in your own lifetime isn't a small thing to you. It never was. It's personal. It always has been, and it always will be. So why does any of this actually matter to you? Because underneath all the budget fights and rocket engineering sits one question that isn't really about Pluto at all. It's about water. Persephone was designed, more than anything else, to answer whether Pluto is hiding a subsurface ocean, a layer of liquid water sealed beneath miles of ice, kept warm not by sunlight, but by heat, left over from the world's own violent formation billions of years ago. That may sound like a strange thing for a frozen little world at the very edge of the solar system to be hiding. But it's the exact same question driving missions toward Jupiter's moon Europa and Saturn's moon Enceladus, both of which already show real evidence of vast oceans locked beneath their icy, cracked shells. Wherever there's liquid water, sheltered and stable for long enough, there's a chance, however small, for something resembling life to take hold. That's not science fiction, and it's not exaggeration for the sake of a good story. That's the actual reason serious scientists keep quietly returning to these frozen little worlds instead of simply writing them off as dead rocks with nothing left to teach us. Now picture standing there on Pluto's nitrogen ice plains at high noon. The sun overhead is roughly 1,000 times dimmer than the one you know, but it's still bright enough to read by, bright enough to cast a shadow at your feet. Above you, Charon hangs in the sky, appearing about 7 times larger than our own moon looks from Earth, close enough that you could trace its gray, frozen features with your eyes alone. It's dim enough up there to still make out stars in the daytime sky. Cold, quiet, and strangely beautiful, not the lifeless void people imagine when they hear the word Pluto. And maybe that's exactly why so many of you have never let this world go. Not really, not even after all these years. You grew up drawing 9 planets on a poster board taped to a classroom wall, memorizing them in order, chanting some silly sentence to keep the names straight. And then, one summer, without your vote, without anyone asking your opinion at all, Pluto was simply erased from the official list. Some of you decided right then, quietly, that you didn't agree with that decision, and you never really changed your mind. You still don't. And whether or not anyone ever secures the funding to sail a spacecraft back into orbit around that small, defiant, stubborn little world in your own lifetime isn't a small thing to you. It never was. It's personal. It always has been, and it always will be. So where does that leave us right now? Unresolved. Genuinely, honestly unresolved. The ocean question, the one that matters most, stays open indefinitely under current funding. Nobody knows if Pluto is hiding liquid water beneath that thick shell of ice, and nobody's going to know anytime soon. Not because scientists stopped caring, but because the money to find out isn't there, and there's no clear sign right now that it's coming. The instruments exist, on paper, and the scientists exist too, ready, some having waited entire careers for a chance like this. What's missing is the funding to send something back out there to look. And here's the tension sitting underneath all of this, right now, while you're watching. New Horizons is still out there, still alive. Still transmitting from deeper in the Kuiper Belt than any human-made object has ever traveled. Still sending back data about a vast, mostly unmapped region of our solar system. But its funding isn't settled once and locked away forever. It gets relitigated every single appropriation cycle, argued over again in budget rooms most of us will never see. The spacecraft that gave us our only close look at Pluto, the one carrying a piece of one man's lifelong obsession 3 billion miles into the dark, could still go silent. Permanently, before a second mission to that world ever leaves the launch pad. That's not a hypothetical scare tactic. That very nearly happened already, in 2025, in an actual budget document. And then there's the date. A real one, locked in by orbital mechanics, not by anyone's opinion, mood, or political appetite for space exploration in a given year. Any serious Pluto orbiter needs a gravity assist from Jupiter to make the trip even remotely feasible, borrowing speed from the largest planet in the solar system, the way a slingshot borrows tension from a stretched band. Jupiter only lines up correctly for that maneuver during a narrow window, roughly between 2029 and 2032. Miss it, and the next real opportunity doesn't return for close to another decade, no matter how much money appears. The planets don't negotiate. They don't wait for budgets to catch up. So somewhere between right now and the early 2030s, a decision that nobody is actively making is quietly making itself anyway. If nothing changes in the next few years, the window closes on its own, without a headline, without a formal vote, without anyone ever standing up and saying no. It will simply stop being possible, the way a train you didn't know you needed to catch leaves the station without you. And maybe that's the most honest way to end this, not with an answer, but with a countdown almost nobody is watching. The ocean underneath Pluto's ice, if it's there at all, has been waiting patiently for over 4.5 billion years. The real question left is whether we can find the will to go look before our own narrow window quietly runs out. There's one last quiet detail worth sitting with before we go, and it's the quietest one in this entire story. Somewhere aboard New Horizons, bolted quietly into the spacecraft itself, rides a small canister containing the ashes of a man named Clyde Tombaugh. In 1930, working alone at a telescope in Arizona, comparing photographic plates by hand, night after night, squinting for the tiniest shift of a single point of light, Tombaugh became the person who discovered Pluto in the first place. He died in 1997, long before any spacecraft ever reached the small, cold world he found. But a piece of him is riding it anyway, out past the orbit of every planet, past the edge of what most of us think of as our solar system at all. Right now, his remains are the first human remains to ever leave it behind entirely. carried outward by the only machine that has ever looked closely at his discovery and sent the picture home. Think about that. The man who found Pluto with nothing but his own eyes and a borrowed telescope is still, in a real sense, out there with it. And that same spirit of patience runs straight through Persephone, the mission that lost its vote, lost its funding, and still refuses to disappear from serious conversation. The engineers who designed it don't call it a project. They call it a 3-generation mission because nobody who proposes it, argues for it, and fights to fund it will live to see it arrive. They're building something for scientists who haven't been born yet. So here's the uncomfortable truth underneath everything we've covered tonight, the images we already have. The ones New Horizons captured in a matter of days back in 2015 may be the only close-up portrait of Pluto that many of us watching right now ever see in our own lifetimes. Not because nobody wants to go back, not because nobody's trying, because going back may simply take longer than a single human life allows, longer than a career, longer than most of the promises anyone in power is willing to make. And maybe that's not entirely sad. Maybe it's just honest, the way the universe has always been honest with anyone patient enough to actually sit still and look at it closely. Some doors take longer than one lifetime to open. Pluto found us slowly, waited patiently for us to notice it at all, and if we ever go back, we'll find our way to it slowly too. If this meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're not done exploring the edges of what we know. And before you go, tell us in the comments, where were you the week those first Pluto photos came back in 2015? Some of you will remember it exactly. We'd love to hear it.